The moment I found out my mother's new husband had lied to his own daughter about whether her mother was alive, I was standing in a reception hall in Savannah, Georgia, holding a glass of champagne I had not touched, wearing a dress I had bought specifically for a day I had tried very hard to feel happy about. I need you to understand the specific texture of that moment before I take you anywhere else in this story. I need you to understand what it feels like to be standing in a room full of flowers and fairy lights and the careful happiness of a wedding reception, wearing shoes that hurt because you bought them for the occasion rather than for your feet, and to watch a realization travel across someone else's face in real time. To watch a young woman you have never met before look from you to her father to you again and feel, from across a reception hall, the precise and devastating moment when a lie that has been maintained for 3 years begins to come apart. Her name was Celeste. She was 26 years old, 4 months younger than me, and she had her father's eyes and her mother's cheekbones, and she was standing near the wedding cake in a pale blue dress that she had clearly also bought specifically for the occasion, because it still had the particular stiffness of something worn for the first time. She was holding a glass of champagne she had not touched either. And she was looking at me with an expression that I will carry inside me for the rest of my life, an expression that was not yet fully formed, that was still assembling itself out of the raw materials of confusion and dawning comprehension, the expression of a person whose brain is running a calculation it has not been given all the correct numbers for. I did not know yet, in that exact moment, what I was seeing. I did not know yet about the lie. I did not know yet about the 3 years. I did not know yet about the letter. All I knew was that this young woman was looking at me with something that felt like recognition without context, the feeling of knowing someone you have never met, and that the quality of her attention was different from the polite attention of a stranger at a wedding. I would understand everything within the next 40 minutes. And what I understood would change not just that day, but the years that preceded it, and the years that would follow it in ways I could not have anticipated and am still, even now, working to fully absorb. My name is Noel Carter. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, the only child of Patricia Carter, who had been a single mother since I was 4 years old, when my father left for reasons that were never fully explained to me in age-appropriate terms, and that I had spent a significant portion of my adult life making a kind of peace with. My mother raised me in a small house in Decatur with the specific focused love of a woman who has decided that the absence of one parent does not mean the diminishment of a child's life, but rather the concentration of everything into what remains. She worked as a paralegal for 22 years. She went back to school for her law degree when I was in high school. She passed the bar when I was 19. She built a life that was, by the time I was grown, genuinely full and genuinely hers. She met Gerald Whitmore at a legal conference in Savannah 4 years before the wedding. He was a family law attorney from Charleston, South Carolina, widowed, she told me, 3 years before they met. His wife had died of cancer. He had a daughter named Celeste who was close to my age. He was kind and soft-spoken and laughed easily and looked at my mother like she was something he had not expected to find and was enormously grateful for. I liked him. That is the honest thing I have to say about Gerald before I tell you what he did. I genuinely liked him. He was attentive to my mother in the specific way that people are attentive when their affection is real rather than performed. And my mother, who had spent 22 years putting everything into me and into the law firm she had built and into the careful architecture of a life that asked nothing of anyone, deserved to be looked at like that. I flew to Savannah for the wedding with the genuine intention of being happy for her. Not performed happiness, not the kind you put on like the uncomfortable shoes. Real happiness, the kind I had been building toward through the months of their engagement as I watched my mother plan and prepare and become, visibly and completely, a woman who had allowed herself to want something personal again. I was her maid of honor. I had written a speech that had made her cry at the rehearsal dinner. I was there. Fully there. Or I intended to be. The wedding ceremony was at a chapel near Forsyth Park in the late afternoon, the October light doing what October light in Savannah does, which is to turn everything it touches gold and slightly unreal. Gerald cried when my mother walked in. I watched him cry and I thought, this is real, this is a man who loves her, and I let that thought do the work of displacing the smaller, less generous thoughts that a daughter has when her mother marries someone she has only known for 4 years. At the reception, I met people I had not met before, Gerald's family and colleagues and friends, and I navigated those introductions with the particular social performance of a person who is genuinely trying to be present and finds it requires more effort than it should. I shook hands and smiled and answered questions about my work, which is medical research administration, a field that produces polite interest in the eyes of people at weddings and not much else. I drank water and pretended it was champagne for a while, and then switched to actual champagne and held it without drinking it because I was managing a low-level anxiety that I was attributing, at that point, to nothing more specific than the general emotional complexity of watching your mother marry someone. And then I saw Celeste near the wedding cake. And Celeste saw me. I want to try to describe what passed between us in that first look, across the noise and flowers and careful happiness of the reception hall, because I think it matters, and because I have thought about it many times since. It was not dramatic. There was no gasp, no visible shock. It was quieter than that. It was the specific quality of recognition I mentioned before, the feeling of a puzzle piece landing without yet understanding which puzzle it belongs to. She looked at me and I felt, without knowing why, that she had been waiting for me, not me specifically. But this, whatever this was, she crossed the room. I watched her come and I did not move, partly because I did not know what was happening and partly because whatever was happening felt like the kind of thing that needed to be met rather than approached. She stopped in front of me and she said, very quietly and very carefully, "I'm Celeste, Gerald's daughter." I said, "I know, I'm Noel, Patricia's daughter." She said, "How old are you?" The question landed strangely, out of social context, the kind of question you ask when you need a specific piece of information and do not have the time or the safety for the social forms that usually frame it. I told her. 26. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I'm 26 too." I said, "Okay." She said, "My mother has been dead for 3 years, according to my father." I heard what she said. I understood the grammar of it. And then, like a picture developing in a dark room, the full image of what she was telling me arrived, and I felt the specific nausea of a realization that is also, in a terrible way, clarifying. I said, "What do you mean according to your father?" Celeste looked over her shoulder toward Gerald, who was standing on the other side of the reception hall with my mother, his hand on the small of her back, laughing at something one of his colleagues had said. Then she looked back at me. She said, "My mother is not dead. My mother is alive and living in Charleston, and she has been alive this entire time, and my father told me 3 years ago that she died because he did not want to explain why they divorced, and it was easier to tell a daughter that her mother was gone than to explain what actually happened." The reception hall noise continued around us. The band was playing something gentle in the corner. Someone laughed near the bar. A child ran past us in the direction of the dance floor. The world went on being a wedding reception while the two of us stood in it and held the specific weight of what Celeste had just said. I said, "Does my mother know?" Celeste's expression told me everything before she spoke. She said, "I don't know what your mother knows. I only found out the truth myself 8 months ago." 8 months ago, which meant Gerald had known for 8 months that his daughter knew his wife was not dead. Which meant Gerald had proposed to my mother, who believed she was marrying a widower, while knowing that his daughter knew the truth. Which meant the wedding I was standing in, the wedding my mother had planned with genuine joy and genuine hope, and the specific courage of a woman who allows herself to want something after a long time of not wanting, was built on a structure that was not what it appeared to be. I looked across the room at my mother. She was still laughing at whatever Gerald's colleague had said. She had flowers in her hair, small white ones, because she had asked me at the florist what I thought, and I had said the flowers in the hair, and she had said, "Are you sure?" and I had said, "Absolutely." She was wearing a dress the color of champagne, and she was, in that moment, the most beautiful I had ever seen her and the most at ease and the happiest, and I had to look away. I turned back to Celeste and I said, "Tell me everything." We found a small anteroom off the main hall, a coat room with a bench and enough space to sit across from each other, and Celeste told me everything. I am going to tell you what she told me, but I want to first tell you something about Celeste herself, because she deserves more than to exist in this story solely as the bearer of information. Celeste Whitmore was a woman who had spent 3 years grieving a mother who was not dead. 3 years of carrying a loss that was a fabrication, of making the specific accommodations that people make for grief, the way you speak about someone in the past tense and feel their absence as something physical and build a version of yourself that has incorporated the absence and continued. She had done all of that. She had grieved and rebuilt and continued. And then 8 months ago, she had received a Facebook message from a woman she did not recognize. The woman was her mother, Diane Whitmore. Alive and well in Charleston, South Carolina, 2 hours from where Celeste lived, separated from Gerald by a divorce that had been finalized 6 years ago, not by death, but by the ordinary mechanisms of a marriage that had ended, a marriage that had apparently ended badly enough that Gerald had found it preferable, 3 years later, to tell his daughter she was dead. I want to pause here and ask you to sit with that for a moment, because I think it requires a moment. A man told his adult daughter that her mother was dead. Not to a young child, not to someone too small to seek verification, but to a 23-year-old woman who was fully capable of doing her own research, who had friends and internet access and every tool available to discover the truth, and who was told a lie specific enough and delivered with enough apparent emotion that she had believed it completely. The lie had required maintenance. It had required Gerald to speak of Diane in the past tense, to deflect questions about the death, to construct a version of events that held together under the weight of a daughter's grief. He had done all of this for 3 years, and then he had begun dating my mother. Diane Whitmore, Celeste's mother, had reached out through Facebook because she had heard, through the specific and reliable grapevine of a small professional community, that Gerald was engaged to a woman in Atlanta. She had reached out to Celeste not to damage anything but to warn her. Because Diane knew something that Celeste did not yet know, and that my mother definitely did not know. She knew about the pattern. She knew that Gerald's relationship with truth was flexible in specific and targeted ways, and she knew that the woman he was about to marry deserved to know who she was marrying. Celeste had spent 8 months deciding what to do with what she knew. 8 months of processing first, the revelation that her mother was alive, which required its own separate and enormous reckoning. 8 months of communicating with Diane, rebuilding a relationship that had been severed not by death, but by a lie. 8 months of looking at her father and knowing what she knew and trying to understand what her obligation was. She had tried to talk to Gerald. She told me this in the coat room while the band played something gentle in the other room. She had confronted him 3 months before the wedding, and he had admitted the lie about Diane being dead, quietly and without particular remorse, and told her it was complicated and that it was a long time ago, and that he hoped she would not let old history interfere with his new happiness. He had said the words old history. He had said new happiness. When she pointed out that my mother did not know she was marrying a man who had lied comprehensively to his own daughter for 3 years, he said that he planned to tell her in his own time. His own time had apparently not yet arrived, because here we were at his wedding. I was quiet for a long time after Celeste finished. I was sitting on the bench in the coat room of a Savannah reception hall in my uncomfortable shoes and my carefully selected dress, and I was thinking about my mother on the other side of the door, laughing with flowers in her hair. I was thinking about the speech I had written. I was thinking about Gerald crying when my mother walked down the aisle, which I had taken as evidence of the realness of his love, and which I was now rereading in a different light. And I was thinking about something else. Something I had not yet said to Celeste, but which was moving through me with increasing force as I sat with everything she had told me. I was thinking about what my mother deserved. About the specific thing that a woman who had spent 22 years alone, who had built everything herself, who had finally allowed herself to want something personal and to trust someone enough to build it with, deserved from the people around her. She deserved the truth. She deserved it before she signed the legal documents that had been signed that afternoon in the chapel near Forsyth Park. She deserved it from Gerald, and she had not received it from Gerald, and the question of what to do with that was the most difficult question I had ever been asked to answer. I looked at Celeste. She was looking at me. We were two 26-year-old women in a coat room at a wedding, having just recognized each other as people who were each carrying part of the same story. And we were both, I think, understanding that the decision about what to do next was not ours alone to make. Celeste reached into the small bag she had brought to the wedding. She pulled out an envelope. It was not new. It was an envelope that had been handled many times, the paper soft at the edges and the flap sealed and then carefully preserved. She held it for a moment before she said anything. She said, "My mother wrote this 6 years ago, the day after the divorce was finalized. She gave it to me and told me to keep it and that I would understand someday when to open it." She paused. "I've been carrying it for 6 years. I've never opened it." I looked at the envelope. I did not reach for it. I said, "Why didn't you open it?" She said, "Because she told me I would know when, and for 6 years I kept waiting to know when." She looked down at the envelope. "I think I know now." She opened it. She had kept it for 6 years unopened, and she opened it in a coat room at her father's wedding with a woman she had met 40 minutes earlier. I watched her unfold the letter inside. I watched her read it. I watched her face as she read it, and what I saw on her face as her eyes moved down the page was the specific expression of someone receiving something they did not know they needed, but that fits so precisely into a space that has been waiting for it that the arrival is both surprising and inevitable. When she finished, she looked up at me. Her eyes were wet. She handed me the letter. "I want to tell you what was in it. But first, I need to tell you that the letter was not, as I might have anticipated given everything I had just learned, an angry document. It was not a letter written by a woman seeking to damage or expose or wound. It was a letter written by a woman who was in pain and who loved her daughter and who was trying, from within that pain, to give her daughter something useful, something that would hold, something that would be true when everything else was unclear. The letter was from Diane to Celeste, and it said this, in the careful, slightly formal handwriting of a woman who had thought very hard about every word. It said that the marriage was over, and that the reasons were complicated in the way that all ended things are complicated, and that Celeste did not need to carry the weight of understanding all of those reasons right now. It said that Gerald was not a bad man in the way that bad men are obviously bad, but that he was a man who had a complicated relationship with truth when truth was inconvenient, and that this was not a thing that would get better with time, and it was something Celeste should know so that she could navigate her relationship with her father with clear eyes, rather than with the painful confusion of not understanding why certain things felt wrong. It said that whoever Gerald eventually loved after her, that person deserved to know this about him. Not as punishment, as information. Because everyone who makes a serious commitment to another person deserves to make it with accurate information about who that person actually is. It said, near the end, that Celeste was the best thing she and Gerald had ever made together, and that the love Diane had for her was the only uncomplicated thing in the whole complicated story of their marriage, and that she was writing this letter not in bitterness, but in the specific, clear-eyed love of a mother who wants her daughter to see clearly even when clarity is harder than comfort. It was signed simply Mom. And below the signature, one more line. It said, "When you know when to open this, you will also know what to do with it." I folded the letter carefully and gave it back to Celeste. She folded it and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope back in her bag, and we sat together in the coat room for another moment in silence. Then I said, "I need to tell my mother." Celeste said, "I know." I said, "Tonight." She said, "I know." I said, "Will you come with me?" She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes." What happened next is the part of this story that I have told and retold in my own mind more times than I can count, not because it was the most dramatic part, but because it was the most difficult, and because difficulty, when you move through it with honesty, leaves a mark that you carry forward, and that changes the shape of the person you become. We went back into the reception hall. I found my mother near the bar, talking to one of Gerald's cousins, and I touched her arm and I said quietly that I needed to speak with her privately and that it was important. She read my face the way mothers read their children's faces, with the specific fluency of 26 years, and she excused herself immediately and followed me. I led her to the coat room. Celeste was waiting. My mother looked at Celeste and then at me and then at Celeste again. She said, "What's happening?" I said, "Sit down." She sat. I sat beside her. Celeste sat across from us, and I told my mother everything that Celeste had told me. I told her clearly and without unnecessary softening, because my mother is a lawyer and she has spent 22 years operating in a world where clarity matters more than comfort, and she deserves to be spoken to that way. I told her about the lie to Celeste about Diane's death. I told her about the 8 months since Celeste found out. I told her about Gerald being told by his own daughter that the lie was known and saying he would tell her in his own time. I told her about Diane's letter. My mother listened without interrupting. This is a thing she does in court, and I had seen it in court, but I had never been on the receiving end of it, and it was both impressive and slightly frightening. The quality of her listening, the way she received information without leaking reaction until she had all of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Show me the letter." Celeste took the letter from her bag and handed it to my mother. My mother read it. She read it once and then she read it again. Then she folded it and held it in her hands and looked at the wall of the coat room for a long time. She did not cry. I want to tell you that she did not cry, not then, and I want to tell you why that mattered to me. She had cried at the rehearsal dinner when I read the speech. She had cried in the chapel when Gerald said his vows. She was not a woman who did not feel things. She was a woman who had decided, in that coat room, that what was required of her was not feeling but thinking, and she was applying herself to thinking with the full force of everything she had spent 22 years building. She said, finally, "Celeste." She looked at Gerald's daughter. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what he told you, and I'm sorry for the 3 years you carried something that was not true, and I'm sorry that you have had to carry the knowledge of this for 8 months without knowing what to do with it." Celeste said, "I tried to tell him." My mother said, "I know, that is not on you." Then she stood up. She straightened her dress. She touched the flowers in her hair once briefly. She picked up the letter from her lap and handed it back to Celeste. And she said, I need to speak to Gerald." She walked out of the coat room. Celeste and I looked at each other. Then we followed her. What happened in the next hour was not a scene. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect a scene, a public confrontation, a moment of high drama in a room full of wedding guests. That is not what happened. My mother found Gerald and she said to him, quietly and in front of no one except his own daughter and hers, that she needed to speak with him privately. He looked at her face and looked at us, and the look he had when he saw Celeste was the look of a man who has been anticipating something and has just understood that it has arrived. They spoke in a small office off the main hall for 35 minutes. I do not know everything that was said. I know some of it because my mother told me afterward, and I know that she asked him questions with the precision of a lawyer who has practiced this kind of examination, and that he answered them, eventually, with something closer to honesty than he had offered before. I know that she asked him why, and that he said that he had not wanted Celeste to have to process the complexity of the divorce, which my mother pointed out was an explanation about his own comfort rather than his daughter's welfare. I know that he said he had intended to tell her, and that she asked him when exactly he had intended to do that, and that he did not have a good answer. I know that at the end of the 35 minutes, my mother came out of the office alone, and that the expression on her face was not the expression she had been wearing for the rest of the day. The guests at the reception did not, for the most part, understand what had happened. They saw the bride and groom spend some time apart at what should have been their reception, and they attributed it to the various explanations that people attribute things to at weddings: emotion, exhaustion, a family conversation that needed to happen. The band played. The cake was cut, eventually, because my mother decided that not cutting the cake would create more questions than cutting it. People danced. The evening concluded in the approximate shape of a wedding reception. Gerald and my mother drove to the hotel they had booked for the first night of what was supposed to be a honeymoon. What happened in that hotel and in the days and weeks that followed is a story that belongs to my mother, and that I will tell you only the parts of that she has given me permission to tell, which is the parts that matter for the broader truth of what this experience was. My mother did not leave Gerald immediately. I want to tell you that clearly because I think the narrative expectation would be that she would, that the discovery of what had been hidden from her would result in an immediate and decisive end. She did not leave immediately. She is a lawyer, and she understands that decisions made in the acute phase of discovery are not always the decisions that serve you best in the long term, and she gave herself time. She gave herself 6 months of conversations and sessions with a therapist and a process of determining what she actually knew and felt and wanted, separate from what the shock of the discovery was telling her to do. At the end of those 6 months, she left. She left because she concluded, through the careful and honest process she applied to it, that the lie to Celeste was not an isolated incident, but rather evidence of a way of operating in the world that she could not build a life on. Not because she could not forgive it. She is, in many ways, a more forgiving person than I am, but because trust, for my mother, is not simply an emotional condition but a structural one. It is the thing that holds everything else up. And she had discovered that the structure had a foundation she had not been shown, and she was not willing to build on it. She is, as I tell you this story, 49 years old. She is practicing law in Atlanta in the firm she built. She has gone back to being Patricia Carter, which is the name she was before and the name she will carry forward. She is, by any honest measure, okay, not instantly happy in the simple way. Okay in the deeper, more durable way that comes from having been through something and come out the other side knowing more about yourself than you knew before. Gerald and my mother are divorced. The divorce was handled by attorneys other than themselves, as is proper. Now I need to tell you about Celeste and Diane. Because that story did not end in Savannah. That story continued, and it is the part of all of this that I find the most sustaining, the most genuinely moving, when I hold the entire experience and try to understand what it meant. Celeste and her mother Diane spent the 6 months following the wedding doing the specific and necessary work of rebuilding a relationship that had been interrupted not by time or distance or disagreement, but by a lie. Diane was, as Celeste described her to me in the months we had gotten to know each other, exactly the person the letter had suggested she was. Clear, direct, honest about what had happened and about her own part in it, which included the acknowledgement that she had not fought hard enough to maintain her relationship with Celeste during the years after the divorce. She had allowed Gerald to manage the communication. She had allowed the distance to grow. She had written the letter and given it to Celeste and kept her distance, trusting that the when would arrive. She owned all of that. She did not make Gerald solely responsible for what Celeste had lost. The process of rebuilding is ongoing. It is not simple, and it is not a clean reunion narrative. It is two people who missed 3 years of each other's actual lives trying to build genuine knowledge of who the other person currently is rather than who they remember. It is complicated and slow, and from what Celeste tells me, genuinely worth the complication. Celeste and I are friends. I want to tell you that clearly because I think it is the most unexpected outcome of the day we met in the reception hall, and it is the one I am most grateful for. We met at her father's wedding to my mother, and we became, through the specific alchemy of shared experience and mutual honesty, something that neither of us had anticipated. She is the person I call when something happens that requires a witness who already knows the full context. She is the person who understood, without being told, what it was like to spend a day trying to be fully present for a parent's happiness while holding something unresolved underneath it. We were both trying to do the right thing in that reception hall, and we both had incomplete information, and the combination of our two incomplete pictures produced the full one. The letter is framed in Celeste's apartment now. Diane gave her permission to frame it. It hangs in the living room of the apartment Celeste shares with her partner, and when I have visited, I have stood in front of it and read it again and thought about what Diane knew 6 years ago when she wrote it. What she knew about her daughter's character that made her believe the right moment would come. What she knew about the specific and patient way that truth eventually asserts itself regardless of the structures built around it. She knew her daughter would know when. She was right. I want to talk to you now about what I have learned from all of this, And I want to talk about it directly because I think the lesson of this story is not really about Gerald. Though Gerald made choices that caused real harm and those choices have real consequences, and he lives with them. The lesson is not primarily about him. The lesson is about what we carry, about the things we are asked to carry for other people, the half-truths and the managed distances, and the old histories that are actually present histories wearing old clothes, and about what we owe each other in terms of accuracy. Diane's letter said it better than I can, but I want to say my version of it, which is this. Everyone who makes a serious commitment deserves to make it with accurate information, not perfect information. Nobody has perfect information about another person, but accurate information. The truth of who they actually are rather than the story that has been constructed around who they want you to think they are. My mother deserved that. She did not receive it from Gerald. She did not receive it until two women in uncomfortable shoes and carefully selected dresses found each other in a reception hall and recognized each other without knowing why, and had the specific courage to say out loud what they were each carrying. I think about Celeste saying, "I think I know now." I think about the 6 years she carried that envelope. The way she described it to me once, that she had moved it from bag to bag for 6 years, that it was one of the things she always made sure to have with her the way you make sure to have your keys and your phone, that there were days she forgot it was there, and days it was all she could think about. She carried her mother's voice and her mother's clarity and the specific knowledge that when the moment came she would recognize it for 6 years, waiting. That is an act of faith so quiet and so sustained that I find it moving every time I think about it. Faith in her mother, faith in herself, faith that the truth, however long it takes, finds its moment. If this story reached you, if something in it touched something true in your own life, I need you to do one thing right now. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Black Diamonds is here every single week with stories exactly like this one. Stories about the things we carry and the truths we find and the unexpected people who become part of our lives, because we were both in the same room when something real happened. You do not want to miss what is coming next. And in the comments right now, I want your name and your city. Just those two things. Because this channel reaches everywhere, from Savannah to Sacramento, from Charleston to Chicago, from the places where everyone knows the whole story to the places where you are the only person who knows yours. Drop your name and your city right now. I read every comment, every single one. My name is Noel. I am telling you this story from Atlanta, Georgia, where my mother is practicing law and where I am, in the ongoing and imperfect way of someone who has had her understanding of several things rearranged, trying to carry only the things that are mine to carry and to put down the rest. The letter is framed in Celeste's apartment in Charleston. Her mother helped her choose the frame. They did that together. Next week on Black Diamonds, I am going to tell you about a woman who discovered, at her own surprise birthday party, that her husband had invited his entire second family, the one she did not know existed. I am going to tell you what she did in that room full of people. I am going to tell you what she found out about herself in the hours after. And I am going to tell you the thing she said to her husband at the end of that night that made everyone in the room go completely still. Subscribe right now, turn on your notifications, and I will see you next week. Some letters take 6 years to open, but they are always written at exactly the right time.